Hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Today we're going to talk about media bias. And by media bias, I don't mean they're telling us big fat lies and, nothing that they say can be trusted. It's more a matter of there are certain things that the media really doesn't want to tell us that nonetheless are the truth. I wonder why that is. We'll examine that media bias as it relates to Proposition 1 in just a few moments.
Press club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, I welcome you to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Twice a week, I have the opportunity to sit down and, well, in some cases, do the media's job for it in presenting some different perspectives that I'm not telling you have to believe, but I'm offering them as something to give you a more complete picture of what's at stake with some of the issues facing Idahoans. One of those big issues is something that's going to be on the November ballot, Proposition 1, which claims to be about open primaries, but really is about instituting what's called a jungle primary, and more importantly, instituting ranked choice voting in our general elections. These are things which would greatly complicate our election system and make it easier for people who are, shall we say, left-leaning to find it easier to access power, or at least play activist games with the system in order to get into power in the first place. Now, you would think that our legacy media would find it very important to report on, how this works, who stands for it, who is against it, and so forth. But apparently, they have better things to talk about. And one of the things that they just don't really want to talk about, or at least very grudgingly, and only in one case that I can see where they've admitted it, is that Idaho Governor Brad Little actually has come out in opposition to Proposition 1. Now, this is remarkable for a couple of reasons. Number one, Brad Little is not necessarily known as a rock-ribbed conservative who is always on the side of smaller government and less, expensive government. But nonetheless, he is correct in coming out against this. And I've got to give him credit where credit's due. His opposition to Prop 1 seems to be based in principle. Here's his full statement rejecting the leftist-backed proposition. As we inch closer to a big election, Governor Little says, we reflect on the extraordinary importance of our election system in our great state and country. He says elections are the cornerstone of our democratic republic, which is why I made Idaho the first state to take executive action to make sure only citizens vote in our elections. He says Idaho has a strong track record in championing investments that safeguard election integrity and encourage voter confidence. Then Governor Little says, I am opposed to ranked choice voting and signed House Bill 179 in 2023, banning it in Idaho. He says we must promote voting practices that are clear, increase voter participation, and don't undermine confidence in our elections. And ranked choice voting meets none of those standards. Governor Little says Idahoans will make their voices heard on Proposition 1 at the ballot box in November. But he says, as for me, I will not be supporting Proposition 1. That's kind of a big deal. Bigger in the sense that, while he's not exactly one of those troublemaking extremist conservatives out there always trying to thwart government and its attempts to grow, at least that seems to be part of the mainstream narrative. So it's a pretty big deal when the governor says, yeah, I'm not on board with this. The question now is, why don't we hear more about this from mainstream sources? Now, there was a news source that reported on this, and tip of the hat to Greg Pruitt with the Idaho Dispatch. Governor Little says he opposes Proposition 1. Straightforward, a quote from, the governor's press release. No need to spin it. It is what it is. But you don't get that treatment from other media sources. In fact, when it comes to Prop 1, this is the kind of treatment that we get. Look at this. This is the Idaho Statesman. Anti-Prop 1 signs are an offensive, inappropriate misuse of the Idaho state seal. This was an opinion piece that they published. So while they're scolding us, you shouldn't be using the Idaho state seal here. Nonetheless, we don't seem to hear about the fact that not just Governor Little, but actually a number of prominent elected officials have come out saying, no, this is not a good idea. So let's look at media bias, dishonesty on full display as Idahoans consider Proposition 1. This is a wonderful article from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and it really clearly shows you, we'll give you chapter and verse, some of the things that are more important than talking about, who's opposed to this versus who's in favor of it. And by the way, you'll see they do support those who are in favor, especially those who are recently turned out of power. Here's what the article says. It's easy to slam media outlets and paint them as mouthpieces for the left, but it's harder to produce actual evidence of that claim, but not much harder. Right before our eyes, some Idaho news outlets are giving residents a master class on bias and narrative building by omission. That's the key. It's not the big lies they're telling. It's what they refuse to report on. For instance, last week, Idaho Governor Brad Little announced his opposition to Proposition 1. Now, he's doing the right thing by opposing the radical plan to rewrite Idaho's election laws and implement ranked choice voting in the left's latest bid to turn Idaho blue. The biggest names in Idaho news, including KTVB, the Idaho Statesman, the Idaho Press, and all the others, didn't cover it that day. In fact, they haven't covered it at all. A casual look at the statement's recent stories and social media posts shows the news outlet's priorities. Oh, and these are good ones. I can tell you much more important than what's happening with Proposition 1. Thanks to the Statesman, we know Eminem's daughter is pregnant with the rapper's grandchild. We know that the Wavy Talk hair straightener brush is on sale right now. And of course, we know that Kristen Calavari's custody agreement with ex Jay Cutler has changed. Matters of extreme importance to Idaho voters, as I'm sure you would agree. Yet we don't know our Idaho governor's position on a controversial proposition that would toss out Idaho's long-standing election system. That seem a little bit curious to you? Of course, we all understand the Statesman gets national news piped in from across the country. It's standard practice in establishment media operations. They check the news wire and republish the story. So it might be understandable if the Statesman and other publications weren't giving any time, space, or attention to Proposition 1, but that's not what they've been doing. For instance, the Statesman gave sure to give space to outgoing GOP Senator Linda Hartkin so she could endorse the radical proposition. Ironically, in her endorsement, Hartkin wrote, "Together we can ensure that Idaho remains a place where every voice is heard and respected." But that's not what's happening here, is it? In this critical debate, not every voice is being heard. Media types are working actively to silence or ignore those who oppose upending our functioning election system. Now, to give credit again where credit's due, the Idaho Capital Sun deserves a tiny portion of credit for telling you Little's position. The Sun's Clark Corbin buried Little's position in a longer column a few days after the governor made his intentions known. But even that is an indication of bias on the Sun's part. So last year, former Idaho Governor Butch Otter announced his support for the proposition, which was at the time merely a petition circulating among voters. But that endorsement earned him a headline in the Sun. Former President Donald Trump caught a lot of flack for telling Americans how media outlets are the enemy of the people, but he was right. Delivering only one side of political debates is shameful. Conservative commentator George Will correctly wrote, "The media's job is to report the news, not to shape it. When they shape it, they're not doing their job." That's the question you and I need to be asking ourselves. These legacy media outlets in Idaho, are they telling us the news? Are they giving us enough facts that we can make our own informed decision? Or are they carefully, like a helicopter parent, protecting us from our sensitive eyes and minds and ears from things that might lead us into a decision that wouldn't be supportive of whatever their agenda is? It kind of feels that way sometimes. One final thought here. Idaho's corporate media types are clearly not doing their jobs. Media outlets should tell the truth, the whole truth, and then let the people decide the path forward on Proposition 1. The Washington Post slogan is "Democracy dies in darkness." Well, apparently, Idaho media types want their own kind of darkness to thwart a fair election on a radical proposition in Idaho. So the message here is, voters, beware. I know that people say, well, you guys are sure beating this horse a lot, but this is a very important issue. It's important enough that people really deserve to approach the polls in November and vote on this from an informed position. If you're showing up just kind of, well, I heard a thing or two, or maybe I saw an ad once, or somebody I like actually, endorsed it, or somebody I don't like, endorsed it, or whatever. If you're not doing your own due diligence, you're doing yourself and, by extension, the rest of society a disfavor. It's not that hard. And yes, I would encourage you, look at the pros, look at the cons. There are definitely different sides to this issue. But for some reason, the media doesn't seem to trust you with making those decisions on your own. And that's why you'll see headlines like, "Here's what to think about this." Doesn't that imply that somebody else is doing the thinking for you? And does that not feel a little bit insulting that you're such a child that, well, here, we chewed it up. It's even pre-digested, and we'll just spoon feed to you what you're supposed to repeat back to us. You don't need a mama bird giving you your sound bites and telling you this is what you're supposed to think. You're a grown adult. You're a responsible member of society, responsible enough to go and register to vote and then cast that vote. Make it count by making it the informed vote that it should be. I trust you to make the right decision. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is